The auctioneer's gavel came down like thunder, and Adelaide Grant felt the last threads of her dignity snap as cleanly as a rope pulled too tight. 23 years of breathing, hoping, and fighting reduced to a simple transaction conducted beneath the scorching Utah sun in the summer of 1876. Her worth measured in coins that clinked into her stepfather's greasy palm, while he avoided her eyes entirely. She stood on that makeshift platform in the dusty square of Marysvale, her cotton dress clinging to her back with perspiration, her hands trembling so badly she had to clasp them together to hide the shaking. The small crowd of men gathered below looked her over like she was livestock, some with pity in their weathered faces, others with calculation gleaming in their eyes. Her stepfather, Harold Whitmore, counted the money with thick fingers while her mother stood 10 paces back, staring at the distant mountains as though she could transport herself there through sheer force of will. Adelaide had begged her mother that morning, clutched at her skirts like a child, pleaded for intervention, for protection, for anything. But Margaret Whitmore had turned away, choosing her new husband over the daughter she'd carried and birthed, and that betrayal cut deeper than any blade. The winning bidder was a rancher from 30 miles south, a man with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that looked like they'd never learned gentleness. He stepped forward to claim his purchase, and Adelaide felt bile rise in her throat. But before he could reach the platform, another voice cut through the afternoon heat, clear and firm as church bells on Sunday morning. "I'll double it." Every head turned toward the speaker. Adelaide's gaze followed, landing on a tall figure standing at the edge of the crowd, partially shaded by the overhanging roof of the general store. He stepped forward into the light, and she found herself looking at a man who couldn't have been more than 27, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water, green-brown and startlingly direct. He wore dusty trail clothes, chaps still on from riding, and a hat that had seen better days pushed back to reveal dark hair that needed cutting. A gun belt hung low on his hips, worn from use but not from show. Everything about him spoke of competence, of a man who knew exactly what he was doing at every moment. Harold's eyes lit up with greed, and he didn't hesitate. "Sold to the cowboy there. Step up and pay, mister." The cowboy moved through the parting crowd with an easy, rolling gait that spoke of years in the saddle. He counted out bills without flinching at the amount, far more than any reasonable person would pay, more than Adelaide could comprehend being worth. Harold snatched the money and stuffed it into his vest pocket, then grabbed his wife's arm and began steering her toward the saloon without a backward glance at the daughter. They just sold like a piece of furniture they no longer needed. Adelaide stood frozen on the platform, unable to make her legs work, unable to process the fact that her fate had just been decided by the thickness of a stranger's wallet. The cowboy approached the platform and stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't the leer she'd expected, wasn't the cold assessment of property. If anything, he looked troubled, like he'd just made a decision he wasn't entirely certain about. "Madam," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that the dispersing crowd wouldn't hear. "My name is James Foster. I have a horse tied up at the hitching post yonder, and a ranch about 3 hours' ride from here. I'd be obliged if you'd come with me peacefully, but I'll understand if you need a moment to collect yourself." She stared at him, trying to find words that had abandoned her entirely. Her throat felt tight, her chest constricted. This man had just bought her, owned her, according to the law and the transaction that had taken place. She had no rights, no recourse, no escape, and yet he stood there asking her to come peacefully as though she had a choice in the matter. "I don't have anything to collect," she finally managed, her voice coming out rougher than she'd intended. "They didn't allow me to bring anything." Something flickered in James Foster's eyes, a flash of anger quickly controlled. He nodded once, then extended his hand to help her down the platform steps. Adelaide looked at that offered hand for a long moment, calloused and strong, capable of crushing or protecting. She thought about refusing, about running, about screaming, but what would be the point? She had nowhere to go, no one who would take her in. At least this man had kind eyes, even if she couldn't trust what that kindness might mean. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. He steadied her as she descended the steps, her legs wobbling after standing rigid for so long. When she reached the ground, he released her hand immediately and gestured toward the hitching post where a large bay horse stood waiting, saddlebags packed and ready for travel. "Can you ride?" he asked as they walked, matching his pace to hers. "Not well," Adelaide admitted. "I've been on a horse before, but not often." "You'll ride with me then. It's a long way and the trail isn't easy for someone not used to it." He untied the horse with quick, efficient movements, then turned to her. "I'm going to lift you up now. Is that all right?" The fact that he asked, that he treated her like a person capable of giving or withholding consent, made something crack in the careful wall she'd been building around her emotions. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and he placed his hands on her waist and lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He swung up behind her a moment later, settling into the saddle and reaching around her for the reins. She was surrounded by him, his chest against her back, his arms creating a cage that should have felt threatening but somehow didn't. "Hold onto the saddle horn," he instructed, and she gripped it gratefully as he urged the horse into motion. They rode through Marysvale in silence, past the buildings that had formed the backdrop of Adelaide's entire life. The general store where she'd bought penny candy as a child, the church where she'd been baptized, the schoolhouse where she'd learned to read and cipher. The people she'd known all her life watched them pass, some with sympathy, others with the kind of satisfaction people get from witnessing someone else's misfortune. Mrs. Henderson, who had once been her mother's closest friend, actually turned her back as they rode by. Adelaide felt each slight like a physical blow, but she kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Once they cleared the town limits and headed into the open country, James spoke again. "I need you to understand something, Miss Adelaide. I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to get you out of that situation. What happened back there, that whole spectacle, it made me sick to my stomach. But the only way to stop it was to make sure you didn't end up with someone who'd actually treat you like property." Adelaide processed his words slowly, afraid to hope, afraid to believe. "You don't even know me," she said. "Why would you spend that kind of money on a stranger?" He was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the scrub brush. "My mother was sold once," he finally said, his voice tight. "Before the war, down in Missouri. My father bought her freedom and married her, raised me to believe that every person has worth beyond what someone else decides to pay. When I rode into town this morning and heard what was happening, I couldn't just walk away. I wouldn't be able to live with myself." She twisted slightly to look at him, studying his profile. He kept his eyes on the trail, but she could see the set of his jaw, the sincerity in the lines around his mouth. "What happens now?" she asked. "You said you have a ranch." "I do. It's not much, just a cabin and some grazing land, about 200 head of cattle. I work it alone mostly, hire some help during roundup. It's isolated, but it's honest work." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You can stay there as long as you need to. I'll sleep in the barn. When you're ready, When you've figured out what you want to do, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. You have my word on that." Adelaide turned back to face forward, her mind spinning. Everything that had happened in the past few hours felt surreal, like a fever dream she might wake from at any moment. But the solid warmth of the man behind her, the rolling gait of the horse beneath them, the harsh sunlight beating down on her uncovered head, all of it was undeniably real. Her life had been upended, sold away by the people who should have protected her, and now she was riding into the wilderness with a stranger who claimed he wanted nothing from her. "Why?" she asked, the question bursting out of her. "Why really? Nobody does something like this for nothing." James was quiet again, and she could feel him choosing his words. "Maybe I'm trying to make up for the fact that nobody did it for my mother," he said. "Maybe I'm just doing what any decent person should do. Or maybe I saw a woman in trouble and couldn't stand by. Does the reason matter so much?" "Yes," Adelaide said fiercely, "because I need to know what you'll expect in return. I need to know what I'm walking into." "Nothing," he said firmly. "I expect nothing from you. You don't owe me anything, Adelaide, and if you don't believe that now, maybe you will in time." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not anymore. So she held onto the saddle horn and watched the landscape change as they rode, the town disappearing behind them, replaced by rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and majestic against the brilliant blue sky. It was beautiful country, harsh but honest, and Adelaide found herself breathing a little easier the farther they got from Marysvale. They rode for what felt like hours, stopping once at a creek to let the horse drink and to stretch their legs. James offered her jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, and though Adelaide's stomach churned with nerves, she forced herself to eat. She'd need her strength, whatever came next. He didn't try to make conversation, seeming to understand that she needed time to process, to adjust to this strange new reality. Instead, he busied himself checking the horse's hooves and adjusting the saddle, giving her space while still remaining aware of her presence. When they mounted again, Adelaide's muscles protested. She wasn't used to riding, and the constant motion was taking its toll. James must have noticed her stiffness because he said, "We'll be there within the hour. The cabin has a real bed. You'll be able to rest properly." "And you'll really sleep in the barn?" she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "I really will," he confirmed. "I meant what I said, Adelaide. You're safe with me." The sun was lowering toward the horizon when they finally crested a rise, and Adelaide saw the ranch spread out below them. It was exactly as he described it, modest but well-maintained. A sturdy cabin made of logs and chinked with clay sat near a creek lined with cottonwoods. A barn stood nearby, weathered but sound, and several corrals held horses and cattle. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard, and a vegetable garden showed signs of recent tending. It was the kind of place that spoke of hard work and careful planning, nothing fancy but solid and real. James guided the horse down the slope toward the cabin. As they approached, Adelaide noticed details that surprised her. Curtains hung in the windows, simple but clean. A rocking chair sat on the small porch, and flowers grew in a patch near the door, bright splashes of color against the weathered wood. This wasn't just a man's rough camp. Someone had tried to make this place a home. "My mother lived here until last year," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "She passed during the winter, pneumonia. I've kept things up as best I can, but some of her touches remain." "I'm sorry," Adelaide said, and meant it. There was grief in his voice, still fresh enough to cut. He brought the horse to a stop near the porch and dismounted, then reached up to help Adelaide down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, muscles protesting after hours of riding. James steadied her with a hand on her elbow until she found her balance. "Take your time," he said. "Go on inside. There's a pump in the kitchen for water, and the stove should still have coals if you want to heat some for washing. I'll tend to the horse and give you privacy." Adelaide climbed the porch steps on shaking legs and pushed open the door. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and she stood for a moment letting her eyes adjust. Gradually, the space revealed itself. A main room with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth. A kitchen area with a cast iron stove, shelves holding dishes and cooking implements. 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was tidy, well organized, though dust had accumulated on some surfaces. It was clear James had been telling the truth about living alone. She moved to the kitchen and found the pump, working the handle until clear water gushed out. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, not realizing until that moment how thirsty she'd been. Then she splashed water on her face, washing away the dust and sweat of the journey, and felt marginally more human. A sound from the doorway made her turn. James stood there, hat in his hands, looking uncertain in a way he hadn't on the trail. "The bedroom on the right was my mother's," he said. "It has clean linens. The one on the left is mine, but I'll clear out my things and move them to the barn. You should have proper privacy." "You don't have to do that," Adelaide said, though her heart wasn't in the protest. She did want privacy, desperately needed a space that was hers alone, even temporarily. "I know I don't have to," James said. "I want to. It won't take me but a few minutes." He moved past her to the left bedroom and began gathering items, loading them into a canvas bag with efficient movements. Adelaide watched from the doorway, noting the sparse possessions. Some clothes, a razor and shaving soap, a book that looked well read, a photograph in a simple frame. He caught her looking at the photograph and held it up. "My parents on their wedding day." Adelaide looked at the faded image. A young man and woman stood stiffly before the camera, hands clasped, looking both proud and slightly uncomfortable in their formal clothes. The woman was beautiful, with warm eyes and a gentle smile. The man looked stern but kind. "They look happy," she said. "They were," James confirmed. 26 years together before she died. He passed 2 years before that. They had a good life, considering how it started. He placed the photograph carefully in his bag and looked around the room. "That should do it. The bed is freshly made from when I changed the linens last week. There's extra blankets in the chest if you need them." He moved toward the door, and Adelaide found herself saying, "Wait." He paused, looking at her questioningly. She struggled to find words for the confusion of emotions churning inside her. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I don't understand why you did this, but thank you." James nodded slowly. "You're welcome. I'll be in the barn if you need anything, but I won't disturb you. There's food in the larder, help yourself to whatever you want. I'll see about making breakfast in the morning." He settled his hat back on his head and headed for the door, then stopped once more. "Adelaide, you really are safe here. I know you have no reason to believe me yet, but I hope in time you will." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Adelaide stood alone in the cabin as the light faded outside, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. Crickets beginning their evening song, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. She moved to the window and saw James crossing to the barn, his bag slung over his shoulder, moving with that same easy gait she'd noticed in town. She should feel terrified, she thought. She should be planning escape, looking for weapons, barricading herself in. But instead, she felt something unexpected, a tiny, fragile flutter of hope. Maybe James Foster was exactly what he claimed to be, a decent man trying to do right. Maybe she'd been given not a death sentence but a reprieve. Maybe, just maybe, she'd been given a chance at something better than what she'd left behind. Adelaide explored the cabin more thoroughly as the last light faded. The larder held supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, canned goods. Enough to feed 2 people for months. The bedroom James had given her was simple but comfortable, with a real bed covered in a handmade quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes she didn't have. A window looked out toward the mountains, and she could see the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She found herself exhausted, wrung out from the emotional turmoil of the day. She removed her shoes, the only ones she owned, and lay down on the bed fully clothed. The mattress was stuffed with straw and corn husks, rustling as she settled, but it was more comfortable than anything she'd slept on in years. At her stepfather's house, she'd been given a cot in a corner of the kitchen, always cold in winter, always too hot in summer. Adelaide expected to lie awake, her mind spinning with anxiety and uncertainty. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately, as though her body had simply decided it had endured enough for one day and shut down to protect itself. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, disoriented and confused for several moments about where she was. Then memory flooded back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Daylight streamed through the window, and she realized she'd slept the entire night without waking once. The sounds of someone moving around in the kitchen drifted through the door. Adelaide stood and smoothed her dress as best she could, ran her fingers through her tangled hair, and ventured out of the bedroom. James stood at the stove, tending a skillet of bacon and eggs. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, his face freshly shaved, his hair damp as though he'd dunked his head in the creek. He looked up when she entered and offered a tentative smile. "Morning," he said. "I hope I didn't wake you. I tried to be quiet." "You didn't," Adelaide said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "What time is it?" "Near about 7. You slept hard, which makes sense after yesterday. Are you hungry?" Her stomach answered for her with a loud growl, and she felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. But James just grinned and gestured to the table. "Sit. I'll have this ready in a moment." Adelaide sat, watching him work. He moved with the same competence he brought to everything else, flipping eggs with a practiced hand, pulling biscuits from the oven that looked surprisingly good. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought everything to the table, serving her first before taking his own seat across from her. "I wasn't sure how you like your eggs," he said. "I made them over easy, but I can cook them different if you prefer." "This is fine," Adelaide said, and took a cautious bite. The food was simple but well prepared, and she found herself eating ravenously, hungrier than she'd realized. James ate more slowly, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When she'd cleared her plate, Adelaide set down her fork and met his eyes across the table. "We need to talk about what happens now," she said. "You said I could stay here, but I can't just live off your charity. I need to earn my keep somehow." James leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. "I told you, you don't owe me anything. But if it would make you feel better, there's plenty of work around here. The house could use a woman's touch. The garden needs tending, chickens need feeding. I'm not much for cooking beyond the basics. If you wanted to help with those things, I wouldn't object, but I want to be clear that it's your choice, not an obligation." Adelaide nodded slowly. "And when I want to leave, when I've figured out where I want to go, then I'll take you there, or give you money for passage, whichever you prefer." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her intently. "Adelaide, I meant everything I said yesterday. You're not a prisoner here. You're a guest for as long as you need to be." She wanted to believe him so badly it hurt, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. "Why?" she asked again. "You keep saying you don't want anything, but everybody wants something. What do you really want from me? James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Honestly, if I could have anything, I'd want you to stay. Not because I own you or because you owe me, but because you choose to. This place is lonely, Adelaide. It's beautiful and peaceful, but it's lonely. Having someone to talk to share meals with, to just exist alongside, that would mean something to me. But I understand if that's not what you want. I understand if you need to leave as soon as possible. Either way, I'm not going to force you or manipulate you. The choice is yours. His honesty caught her off guard. She'd expected lies, expected manipulation, expected him to reveal ulterior motives. Instead, he was giving her the most dangerous thing of all, truth. Truth she might actually be able to trust. I don't know what I want yet, she admitted. I don't know anything beyond the fact that I can't go back to Marysvale. My mother made her choice and there's nothing left for me there. Then stay here until you figure it out, James said simply. There's no rush. Take all the time you need. Over the following days, a careful routine developed between them. James rose before dawn and headed out to tend the cattle and horses, often gone for hours at a time. Adelaide occupied herself with the house, cleaning away months of accumulated dust, organizing the kitchen, tending the garden that had grown wild in his mother's absence. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than James's simple fare, using the well-stocked larder to make stews and bread and pies. She fed the chickens and collected eggs, mended clothes she found in a basket that had needed attention for some time. The work was hard but satisfying in a way her life in Marysvale had never been. There, she'd been a burden, an extra mouth to feed, constantly reminded of her worthlessness. Here, she saw the results of her labor in tangible ways. The cabin became cleaner, more organized, more welcoming. The garden flourished under her care. James came home to hot meals and expressed genuine appreciation, never taking her work for granted. They talked during those evening meals, cautious at first, testing the waters of conversation. Adelaide learned that James had been running the ranch alone since his father's death, that he'd built the herd up from almost nothing through years of careful breeding and shrewd trading. He read voraciously, had taught himself mathematics and basic veterinary medicine from books. He had dreams of expanding the operation, of maybe bringing in some breeding stock from back east, of making the ranch into something substantial. In turn, Adelaide found herself sharing pieces of her own story. How her father had died when she was 15, leaving her and her mother nearly destitute. How her mother had remarried with almost indecent haste to Harold Whitmore, a man with money but no kindness. How the past 8 years had been a slow erosion of dignity and hope, culminating in that awful auction in the town square. Did they give a reason? James asked one evening, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. How did they justify it? Adelaide pushed food around her plate, appetite gone at the memory. Harold said I was a drain on resources, that I was 23 and unmarried and nobody in town would have me. He said I had no prospects and no value, and this way at least I could be useful to someone. She looked up, meeting James's eyes. My mother didn't argue, she just stood there and let it happen. James's jaw worked, and she could see him fighting for control. That's not love, he said finally. A mother who loves her child would never allow that. I know, Adelaide whispered. I know that now, but it still hurts. He reached across the table and briefly squeezed her hand, the first deliberate touch between them since he'd helped her onto the horse that first day. His hand was warm and calloused, solid and real. You deserved better, he said. You deserve better. Something shifted between them after that conversation. The careful distance they'd maintained began to erode, replaced by a tentative friendship. James started lingering at the dinner table, instead of immediately retreating to the barn. Adelaide found herself asking about his day, genuinely interested in the workings of the ranch. He taught her to milk the cow, a skill she'd never learned in town, and laughed gently when she made a mess of it the first several times. She showed him how to make his mother's recipes, following notes written in a delicate hand in a cookbook she found, and he told stories about his mother while they cooked together. 3 weeks after she'd arrived, James came home leading a horse she'd never seen before, a pretty little mare with a white blaze and kind eyes. Adelaide was in the garden pulling weeds and looked up at his approach. "What do you think?" James asked, patting the mare's neck. "Her name is Daisy. I traded for her in town yesterday. She's gentle, perfect for someone still learning to ride." Adelaide stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Why would you trade for a horse for me?" "Because you should be able to ride out if you want to. You shouldn't be trapped here. If you want to explore, see the country, you should be able to." He led the mare closer. "Besides, I thought maybe you'd like to ride out with me sometimes. There are some beautiful spots on the property I'd like to show you." Adelaide approached the mare slowly, extending her hand for Daisy to sniff. The horse whuffled softly and bumped her nose against Adelaide's palm. "She's beautiful," Adelaide said softly. "But James, this is too much. You've already done so much." "Not nearly enough to make up for what was done to you," James said firmly. "Please, Adelaide, accept this. Let me give you this freedom." She looked at him standing there in the afternoon sunlight, this man who kept giving without asking for anything in return, and felt something crack open in her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you properly, but thank you." "Seeing you smile is thanks enough," James said, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe him. He taught her to ride properly over the following weeks, patient and encouraging as she learned to trust herself on horseback. They rode out together in the evenings when the work was done, exploring the ranch land. He showed her a meadow full of wildflowers, a swimming hole where the creek deepened into a pool, a vista point where you could see for miles in every direction. Adelaide felt herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since childhood, the constant tension she'd carried for years beginning to ease. She also noticed things about James that her initial wariness had prevented her from seeing. The way he moved with unconscious grace, comfortable in his body in a way few men were. The way his face softened when he smiled, transforming from severe to almost boyish. The kindness in his eyes when he looked at her, never demanding, never expectant, just quietly appreciative. The sound of his laugh, rare but wonderful when it emerged. The way he treated animals with gentle respect, the way he kept his word about every small thing, building a foundation of trust through consistent action. She caught herself watching him sometimes, then had to look away, confused by the warmth that flooded through her. She'd never felt this way about anyone, had never had the luxury of considering romance when survival took all her energy. But here, safe and cared for, she found herself noticing James as a man rather than just a rescuer. And that terrified her almost as much as the auction had. Summer deepened into its hottest months, and the work on the ranch intensified. James hired 2 ranch hands for roundup, men he'd worked with before, and they camped in the pastures for 2 weeks while they gathered and sorted cattle. Adelaide cooked for the crew, rising before dawn to prepare hearty breakfasts, packing lunches, having dinner ready when they came in exhausted after sunset. The hands were respectful, tipping their hats and thanking her politely, clearly aware that James wouldn't tolerate anything else. One evening after the hands had bedded down in the barn, James helped Adelaide clean up after dinner. They worked in companionable silence, washing and drying dishes, moving around each other with the ease of long practice. When the last dish was put away, James didn't immediately head to the barn as he usually did. Instead, he stood at the window, looking out at the darkness. "Adelaide," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, wiping down the table. "Are you happy here?" Truly happy, not just making the best of things. She paused, considering the question seriously. Was she happy? A month ago, she would have said happiness was something other people experienced, not her. But now, standing in this clean kitchen in a house she'd helped make a home, her belly full of good food, her body tired from honest work, her heart beginning to heal from old wounds, she realized something important. "Yes," she said, "I am happy. Happier than I've been in years." James turned from the window, and even in the dim lamplight she could see the emotion in his eyes. "Good," he said. "That's all I wanted, for you to be happy." "What about you?" Adelaide asked. "Are you happy?" He smiled, soft and genuine. "Yes. This past month has been the best I've had since my mother died. Having you here, it's made this place feel like a home again instead of just a place I work and sleep. So yes, Adelaide, I'm happy." They stood looking at each other across the kitchen, and something hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Adelaide felt her heart beating faster, felt heat rising in her cheeks. James took a step toward her, then stopped, visibly checking himself. "I should let you get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Big day tomorrow." He left before she could respond, and Adelaide stood alone in the kitchen feeling oddly bereft. She'd wanted him to stay, she realized. She'd wanted him to take that final step, to close the distance between them. The realization kept her awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand when exactly her feelings had shifted from gratitude to something more complicated and far more dangerous. The next morning, one of the ranch hands approached James with news that some of the cattle had broken through a fence line on the eastern boundary and were scattered into rough country. James organized a search party, and to Adelaide's surprise, she found herself volunteering to help. "Are you sure?" James asked. "It's going to be hard riding in difficult terrain." "I can do it," Adelaide said firmly. "Daisy and I have been practicing." James nodded, respect clear in his expression. "All right, stay close to me, and if it gets too rough, you tell me immediately." They rode out as a group, fanning out to search the breaks and canyons where the cattle had fled. Adelaide stuck close to James as instructed, but she found herself enjoying the challenge, the adventure of it. They worked through the morning heat, finding cattle in small groups and herding them back toward the main property. It was exhausting work, but Adelaide felt capable and useful in a way that filled her with pride. They were herding a small group of cows back along a narrow trail when Adelaide's hat blew off, startling Daisy. The mare shied sideways, and Adelaide lost her balance, tumbling from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, knocking the wind from her lungs, and rolled dangerously close to the edge of a steep drop-off. "Adelaide!" James's shout was raw with fear. He was off his horse in an instant, scrambling toward her. He caught her arm just as she started to slide, hauling her back from the edge with strength born of desperation. He pulled her against his chest, holding her tight, his heart pounding so hard she could feel it through his shirt. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her arms and back, checking for injuries. "Adelaide, talk to me. Are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she gasped, still trying to catch her breath. "Just scared, James. I'm all right." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his eyes wild with fear and something else, something intense that made her breath catch for entirely different reasons. "You could have died," he said roughly. "You could have gone over that edge and I couldn't have stopped it." "But I didn't," Adelaide said, lifting her hand to his face without thinking, cupping his cheek. "I'm right here. I'm safe." James closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, his whole body shaking with the aftermath of fear. When he opened his eyes again, Adelaide saw clearly what had been building between them for weeks, maybe from that very first day in the town square. He loved her. This strong, kind, patient man loved her. Adelaide, he breathed her name like a prayer. I can't lose you. I know I have no right to say that, but I can't lose you. You won't, she promised. James, you won't lose me. He kissed her then, urgent and desperate, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other arm wrapped around her waist. Adelaide kissed him back without hesitation, pouring into it all the feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge. She loved him too, had been falling in love with him slowly through every kind word, every gentle gesture, every moment of respect and care. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I've been trying not to, trying to give you space and time, but I love you, Adelaide. I think I've loved you since I saw you standing on that platform looking so brave and so broken at the same time. I love you too, Adelaide whispered, and saying the words felt like freedom. I didn't know what love was supposed to feel like, but this is it. This has to be it. James kissed her again, softer this time, tender and full of promise. Behind them, one of the ranch hands cleared his throat loudly, reminding them they weren't alone. James pulled back with a rueful smile and helped Adelaide to her feet. We should get these cattle home, he said, but he kept hold of her hand, not ready to let go. We should, Adelaide agreed, but she was smiling too, wide and genuine, the kind of smile that came from deep joy. They rode back to the ranch together, hands linked when the trail allowed it, stealing glances at each other like teenagers with a first crush. The other hands said nothing, but Adelaide caught them exchanging knowing looks and small smiles. When they reached the ranch and the work was done, James pulled Adelaide aside. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to do this right. I know the circumstances have been strange, but I want you to know that my intentions are honorable. I want to marry you, Adelaide, if you'll have me. But only when you're ready, only when you're certain that's what you want. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. I'm certain now, she said. I've never been more certain of anything. Yes, James. Yes, I'll marry you. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. The ranch hands whooped and hollered, and for the first time in years, Adelaide felt surrounded by genuine goodwill and happiness. She'd been given away like unwanted cargo, treated as worthless and disposable. But James had received her like precious treasure, had seen her value when no one else had shown her what it meant to be cherished. They were married a month later in a small ceremony in Marysvale. Adelaide had been nervous about returning to the town, but James stood beside her like a wall of support, his hand never leaving hers. The preacher who had known her since childhood married them in the church where she'd been baptized, and if some of the townspeople looked surprised to see her returned as a bride rather than forgotten as a victim, that was their problem. Adelaide's mother attended the ceremony, slipping in at the last moment and sitting in the back. Harold was noticeably absent. After the ceremony, Margaret approached her daughter with hesitant steps. Adelaide, she said softly, you look beautiful. Thank you, Adelaide said, her voice cool. The wound her mother had inflicted was still too raw for easy forgiveness. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I made choices I'll regret until the day I die. But I want you to know that seeing you now, seeing you happy and loved, it eases something in me. I was wrong about everything, and I'm sorry. Adelaide looked at the woman who had given her life but failed to protect it and felt something shift. She was too happy today to carry the weight of anger. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, she said honestly, "but maybe someday. For now, I just need you to know that I'm happy, happier than I ever thought I could be." "That's all I can ask for," Margaret said and slipped away before Adelaide could say more. James appeared at her elbow. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Adelaide said and meant it. "Let's go home." They rode back to the ranch together on a beautiful September afternoon, the heat of summer finally breaking into cooler, gentler weather. James had spent the previous week preparing, and when they arrived home, Adelaide found the cabin transformed. Candles and wildflowers decorated every surface, and he'd prepared a feast for their wedding dinner. He carried her over the threshold like she weighed nothing, and Adelaide laughed, feeling young and carefree in a way she'd never had the chance to feel before. That night, as they lay together in the bedroom that had become theirs, Adelaide traced her fingers along James's jaw. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "For seeing me when no one else did. For treating me like I had value. For loving me." James rolled to face her fully, his eyes serious in the candlelight. "You've always had value, Adelaide, always, and I'm the one who should be thanking you. You took a chance on a stranger. You stayed when you could have left. You chose to love me back. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They made love slowly and tenderly, discovering each other with reverence and joy. Adelaide had been afraid of this part, worried that, despite James's kindness, this would be where she'd discover she was still just property to him. But he proved her fears groundless, treating her body with the same respect and care he'd shown her heart. He made sure of her pleasure before his own, checked in with her constantly, went slow when she needed slow and passionate when she was ready for more. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Adelaide felt a peace she'd never known. She'd been given away like she was worthless, but in James's arms, she felt priceless. He'd received her like treasure, and every day since, he'd shown her that was exactly what she was to him. The years that followed were not always easy. Ranch life was hard work, unforgiving and demanding. There were droughts that tested them, winters that seemed endless, cattle that were lost to disease or predators. But through it all, they had each other. James never stopped treating Adelaide like she was precious, and she never stopped being grateful for the man who had saved her from a fate too horrible to contemplate. 2 years after their marriage, Adelaide gave birth to their first child, a son they named Jacob after James's father. James wept when he held his son for the first time, overcome with emotion. Adelaide watched him cuddle the tiny baby with such tenderness and felt her heart overflow with love. Their son would grow up knowing he was wanted, knowing his father was a good man, knowing what real love looked like. A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Margaret after James's mother, not after Adelaide's. Then another son, then twin daughters who kept them perpetually exhausted and perpetually entertained. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, rooms added with James's capable hands. The ranch prospered as well, the herd growing, hired help becoming permanent employees who built their own families on the land. Adelaide never returned to live in Marysvale, but she made peace with her past in her own way and in her own time. Her mother died when Adelaide was 32, and though their relationship had never fully healed, Adelaide attended the funeral and wept for what might have been. Harold had died 2 years before that, drunk and alone, and Adelaide felt nothing when she heard the news. She'd moved beyond both of them, built a life so full of love and purpose that they'd become small, insignificant figures in her past. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Adelaide with a trip to Salt Lake City, leaving the children with trusted friends. They stayed in a hotel, a luxury Adelaide had never experienced, and spent 2 days just being together without the constant demands of ranch and family. On their last evening, they took a walk through the city, hand in hand like the newlyweds they still felt like. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Spending all that money on me, changing your whole life." James stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Adelaide Foster, you are the best decision I ever made. You and our children, you're everything. Every penny I spent, I'd spend again 1,000 times over. You're worth more than all the gold in these mountains. Don't you know that yet?" "I know," Adelaide said, tears streaming down her face, happy tears that came from a place of absolute certainty. "I know because you show me every single day." He kissed her there in the street as the sun set and the stars began to appear, and Adelaide thought about the girl she'd been, standing on that auction platform, believing her life was over. That girl could never have imagined this moment, this love, this beautiful life that had grown from such terrible beginnings. She'd been given away like cargo, worthless and unwanted. But James had received her like treasure, had polished away the tarnish of her past, and had shown her that she'd always been gold, even when the people who should have known better had failed to see it. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their children. Their oldest son Jacob grew tall and capable like his father, taking on more responsibility on the ranch as he matured. He had his father's work ethic and his mother's fierce heart, and watching him grow into a fine young man filled them both with pride. Their daughter Margaret, always called Maggie, had her grandmother's gentle spirit, but also a steel core that came straight from Adelaide. The younger children brought their own personalities and challenges, filling the ranch house with laughter, arguments, music, and the beautiful chaos of family life. Adelaide expanded the garden every year, until it produced enough vegetables to sell in town as well as feed their growing household. She became known throughout the county for her preserves and pies, winning ribbons at the county fair year after year. James teased her about her competitive streak, and she laughed and admitted he was right, but kept winning anyway. They faced sorrows too, as all lives must. James's mother would have loved to see her grandchildren, and they both felt that absence keenly. One of the hired hands was killed in a riding accident, leaving a young widow and children that James and Adelaide quietly supported for years. A prairie fire one terrible summer destroyed a section of pasture and killed some of the cattle, and they had to rebuild carefully. Through all of it, they leaned on each other, their bond strengthening rather than weakening under pressure. On their 20th anniversary, their children, now ranging from 18 down to 8 years old, surprised them with a party. The whole county seemed to turn out, filling the ranch yard with friends and neighbors. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, the kind of celebration that only happens when people genuinely care about those being honored. James and Adelaide danced together under the stars, moving to a fiddle tune played by their oldest son, and Adelaide felt overwhelmed by the richness of her life. 20 years, James murmured against her hair as they swayed together. "Best 20 years of my life." "Mine too," Adelaide said. "Though that first day I never would have believed we'd end up here." "I believed it," James said. "The moment I saw you, something in me knew. I couldn't let you go to that other man. I couldn't let you be treated like you didn't matter. You mattered then, and you matter more now than ever." Adelaide pulled back to look at him, at the face she'd memorized in all its expressions, the face she woke up to every morning and fell asleep beside every night. He was 47 now, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He'd never been more handsome to her. "I was so scared that day," she admitted. "But you made me feel safe from the very first moment. Even when I didn't trust it, even when I was certain you'd reveal some awful truth, you just kept being good, just kept being you." "That's all I ever wanted to be," James said. "Just myself, and hoping that would be enough for you." "It's more than enough," Adelaide said. "It's everything." They kissed as their children whooped and hollered, as their friends applauded, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. 20 years ago, Adelaide had been sold in a town square, her future a terrifying blank. Tonight, she stood at the center of a life she'd built through love and work and determination, surrounded by people who valued her, cherished by a man who had shown her what true partnership looked like. The next decade brought more changes. Their oldest children married and started families of their own, Jacob bringing his bride to live on the ranch and build a house near the original cabin. Maggie married a shopkeeper in town and moved to Marysvale, of all places, facing down the ghosts of her mother's past with the same courage Adelaide had shown in building her future. The younger children grew and found their own paths, some staying on the ranch, others venturing out into the wider world. James and Adelaide became grandparents, and if they'd thought their own children brought joy, grandchildren brought something even more profound. The freedom to spoil without the full weight of responsibility, the sweetness of watching their children become parents, the way family expanded outward like ripples in a pond. They rocked grandbabies on the porch of the cabin where they'd first begun their life together, telling stories of the old days, keeping memories alive. As they moved into their 50s, the work of the ranch gradually shifted to younger shoulders. James could still outwork men half his age when he needed to, but he no longer needed to prove anything. He'd built something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. He and Adelaide spent more time together, taking rides on gentle mornings, sitting on the porch in the evenings, simply enjoying the peace they'd earned. One spring morning, nearly 30 years after that day in Marysvale, Adelaide woke before dawn and found James already up, standing on the porch watching the sun rise over the mountains. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him, tucking herself against his side. He wrapped his arm around her automatically, a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "Everything," James said. "Nothing. How lucky I am, how grateful I am that I happened to ride into Marysvale that particular day." "It wasn't luck," Adelaide said. "It was fate. It was meant to be." "Maybe," James agreed. "Or maybe it was just one man seeing an injustice and deciding he couldn't live with himself if he didn't act. Either way, it brought me to you, and that's all that matters." Adelaide turned to face him fully, taking his weathered, beloved face in her hands. "You saved me," she said, as she'd said countless times over the years. "You gave me a life when mine had been taken away. You showed me what love actually means. How can I ever thank you enough for that?" "By being exactly who you are," James said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips with gentle reverence. "By staying beside me all these years. By building this life with me. By being my partner, my love, my best friend. That's thanks enough for 1,000 lifetimes." They stood together watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, the same mountains they'd watched together for 3 decades, standing eternal witness to their love. The cattle lowed in the distance, calling to each other as morning broke. Chickens clucked in their coop, waiting to be fed. Smoke began to rise from the chimney of their son's house as his family stirred to life. The ranch was waking up, another day beginning, the cycle continuing as it always had. But in that perfect moment before the day's demands took over, James and Adelaide stood wrapped in each other, Two people who had found in each other everything they'd ever needed. She'd been thrown away, valueless and unwanted, meant to be forgotten. He'd caught her, recognized her worth, and spent every day since proving to her what he'd known from the start, that she was treasure beyond price, a gift beyond measure, the missing piece that had made his life complete. As the sun cleared the mountains and spilled golden light across the valley, James pulled Adelaide closer and whispered the words he'd said every single day since their wedding. "I love you." "I love you too," Adelaide whispered back, the words as true and necessary as breath. "Today and always." And in that promise, spoken and renewed every day for 30 years, lived the truth that love could heal the deepest wounds, that kindness could transform tragedy into triumph, that one person's decision to act with compassion could change the course of a life forever. Adelaide had been given away like unwanted cargo, but James Foster had received her like precious treasure found, and together they'd built something beautiful and lasting and true. Their love story had started in a dusty town square on a terrible day, but it had become something legendary, whispered about by their grandchildren, remembered by the community, proof that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest of endings. The years continued their march as they always do, bringing both joys and sorrows in equal measure. But whatever came, James and Adelaide faced it together, their hands linked, their hearts bound, their love the foundation on which everything else was built. They'd been given an unlikely beginning, but they'd created the most beautiful of endings, one that would echo through generations, a testament to the transformative power of seeing someone's true worth and loving them accordingly. As they finally turned from the sunrise and walked back into the cabin to begin another day, Adelaide glanced back once at the mountain standing sentinel in the distance. She thought of that frightened girl on the auction platform and sent a message across the years. It gets better. You survive. You more than survive, you thrive. And it all starts with a man who sees you not as cargo but as treasure, who receives you not with indifference but with love. Hold on. Your story is just beginning. And in her heart, Adelaide could feel that younger self finally, truly, letting go of the pain, healed at last by the knowledge that love had won, that she'd been found worthy, that her life had become something beautiful and good. She squeezed James's hand, and he squeezed back, and together they walked forward into another blessed day of the life they'd built together. A life that proved beyond any doubt that how a story begins doesn't determine how it ends, and that sometimes, against all odds, unwanted cargo can become precious treasure in the hands of someone who knows how to see true value when it stands before them. Their children and grandchildren would tell their story for generations, the tale of how grandmother Adelaide was saved by grandfather James, how he paid a fortune for her freedom and then gave her the ultimate gift, choice. How she chose to stay, chose to love him, chose to build a life that became the foundation for all of theirs. They would tell it as a love story, which it was, but also as a story about dignity and worth, about seeing past surfaces to the precious core of a person, about treating everyone with the respect and kindness they deserve simply by virtue of being human. And decades later, when James and Adelaide had both passed peacefully into whatever comes next, still together even in death, their grandchildren would gather on the porch of that old cabin and tell the story again. How she'd been given away like unwanted cargo, how he'd received her like precious treasure found, and how from that terrible beginning grew a love story for the ages, one that transformed not just two lives but countless others, rippling outward through time like light spreading across a valley at dawn. The ranch would continue, worked by Foster descendants for generations, the original cabin preserved as a reminder of where it all began, And sometimes, on spring mornings when the light was just right, people would swear they could see two figures standing on that old porch, watching the sunrise together, hands linked and hearts bound, love eternal and unbreakable, proof that the most precious treasures are sometimes found in the most unexpected places, and that the measure of a person's worth has nothing to do with what others say and everything to do with how they are loved and what they build with their lives when given the chance. This was their legacy, not just land or cattle or the material things they'd accumulated, but the knowledge that love transforms, that kindness matters, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, and that sometimes the most profound changes come from one person deciding to do the right thing, no matter the cost. James had spent a fortune to buy Adelaide's freedom, but she'd given him something worth infinitely more. A love that completed him, a partnership that strengthened him, a life that fulfilled him in ways he'd never imagined possible. They'd been given an improbable beginning. These two souls who found each other on the worst day of Adelaide's life and turned it into the first day of their beautiful future together. But they'd made every day since count, building love upon love, memory upon memory, until they'd created something so solid and real that it could withstand anything, even death itself. Their love was written in the land they'd worked together, in the children they'd raised, in the community they'd served, in every sunrise they'd witnessed side by side and every challenge they'd faced hand in hand in the end. That's what mattered most. Not how it started, but how it grew. Not the transaction that brought them together, but the choice they made every single day to stay together, to love harder, to build better, to prove that from the ashes of injustice and cruelty could rise something beautiful and enduring and true. They gave her away like unwanted cargo, but James Foster received her like precious treasure found. And in doing so, he saved them both, giving Adelaide a life worth living and himself a reason to make every day count. And that, in the end, was the greatest love story of all, not about perfection, but about choosing each other. Not about easy circumstances, but about creating beauty from difficulty. Not about what they'd been given, but about what they'd built together with their own hands, their own hearts, their own unshakable commitment to loving each other well and truly, from that first day in Marysvale until the very end of their days and beyond, into whatever eternity holds for two souls who found in each other everything they'd ever needed and more than they'd ever dared to dream possible. Their story would be told and retold, burnished by time into legend, but always carrying at its core the simple truth that changed everything. One person saw another's worth when no one else did, and that single act of recognition and love transformed two lives and countless others, proving that the most revolutionary act in the world is simply treating another human being as the precious treasure they truly are. James gave Adelaide that gift, and she gave it right back to him, and together they proved that love, real love, the kind that sees and values and cherishes, can overcome any beginning and create the most beautiful of endings.